On July 22nd, 1944, 730 delegates from 44 countries locked themselves in a hotel in New Hampshire. What they decided in that room would control how every dollar, pound, and franc moved across borders for the next 80 years. They didn't just design a financial system, they built a cage. The network they created eventually became SWIFT in 1973. Slow, expensive. Analog infrastructure running a digital world. A single wire transfer from Tokyo to New York still touches 7 correspondent banks and takes 3 business days. In a world where you can stream 4K video across the planet in milliseconds, your money crawls through the same corridors it did when disco was popular. But here's what most people missed while they were watching the Ripple versus SEC trial like it was prestige television. On December 7th, 2024, something appeared on the XRP ledger that didn't make headlines, a stablecoin called RLUSD, Ripple USD. Most crypto channels called it just another USDC competitor and moved on to the next meme coin. They were catastrophically wrong. Because while retail investors spent 5 years arguing about whether XRP was a security, Ripple wasn't fighting a legal battle. They were building a Trojan horse. And in 2026, that horse just walked through the gates of the global financial system. I'm going to show you something that most analysts completely overlooked. A specific piece of legislation passed in early 2025 that fundamentally changed the game. Not for crypto, for how $300 trillion of institutional wealth moves between nations, and why XRP isn't a speculative token anymore. It's infrastructure. The plumbing beneath the reset that's already happening. If you're here because you want to understand the wealth continuum, not chase the next pump, you're in the right place. We don't do moon predictions. We do mathematical probability and structural analysis. So let's start with what everyone thought they were watching. December 2020. The Securities and Exchange Commission files a lawsuit against Ripple Labs, alleging that XRP is an unregistered security. The crypto world loses its mind. Exchanges delist XRP. The price collapses from 63 cents to 17 cents in 72 hours. Reddit explodes. Twitter becomes a war zone. Everyone picks a side. And for the next 4 years, that's all anyone talked about. Will Ripple win? Will they settle? What did the Hinman document say? Is Gary Gensler destroying innovation? The narrative consumed everything. Court filings became entertainment. Deposition transcripts got more views than Netflix series. But while everyone was watching the courtroom drama, something else was happening in the background. And this is where the story gets interesting. In November 2021, right in the middle of the lawsuit, Ripple acquired a Swiss company called Metaco for $250 million. Metaco wasn't a payments company. It was a digital asset custody provider. Vaults, security infrastructure, the kind of technology you need when you're holding billions of dollars of institutional wealth. Why would a company fighting for its life in federal court spend $250 million on digital vaults? Then in February 2023, another acquisition. Standard Custody and Trust Company. Another custody play. More infrastructure for holding, not moving, digital assets. The pattern was impossible to ignore if you knew where to look. These weren't the moves of a company trying to survive litigation. These were the moves of a company preparing for institutional adoption at a scale that would require holding trillions in digital assets. But the retail world didn't notice. They were too busy watching the trial. Here's what they should have been asking instead. If Ripple's entire business model was about fast, cheap cross-border payments using XRP as a bridge asset, why were they suddenly obsessed with custody? Why build Fort Knox if you're just moving money? The answer reveals the entire strategy. And it starts with understanding a problem that has plagued XRP since its creation in 2012. Banks are allergic to volatility. They will not use an asset that can move 10% in an hour to settle a $100 million transaction. It doesn't matter how fast your network is. It doesn't matter how low your fees are. If the asset fluctuates while the transaction is processing, you've introduced unacceptable risk into the settlement layer. This was always XRP's existential problem. The technology was revolutionary. The use case was obvious, but the volatility made it radioactive to the institutions it was designed to serve. Ripple tried everything. They built on-demand liquidity. They signed partnerships with MoneyGram and dozens of payment corridors. They proved the technology worked. But the banks still wouldn't touch it at scale. Because a 20-cent price swing on a $5 million transfer isn't a rounding error. It's a career-ending compliance violation. So Ripple made a decision that looked like surrender but was actually genius. They would give the banks exactly what they wanted. Stability, regulatory compliance, something that looked and felt like the dollar but lived on their ledger. December 2024. RLUSD launches on the XRP ledger and Ethereum, a dollar-backed stablecoin, fully reserved, audited monthly, regulated by the New York Department of Financial Services. The most boring, compliant, institutional-friendly product imaginable. The crypto purists were furious. They said Ripple sold out, that they abandoned decentralization. that RLUSD was just capitulation to the traditional finance system they were supposed to be disrupting. They didn't understand what they were looking at. RLUSD wasn't capitulation. It was the key that unlocked everything. Here's how the Trojan horse works in practice. A Japanese bank needs to send 100 million yen to a correspondent bank in New York. Under the current SWIFT system, that transaction touches 5 to 7 intermediary banks. Each takes a fee, each adds a delay, each introduces counterparty risk. The full settlement takes 2 to 3 days. Now, same transaction on the XRP ledger with RLUSD. The Japanese bank converts yen to RLUSD on a regulated exchange. That RLUSD moves across the XRP ledger in 3 to 5 seconds. It arrives in New York, converts instantly to dollars. Total time, less than 1 minute. Total cost, fractions of a penny. The bank never touched XRP, never worried about volatility, never had to explain to compliance why they're using crypto. They used a regulated stablecoin on a fast ledger. Nothing scary, nothing revolutionary, just better plumbing. But here's the part that changes everything. RLUSD requires liquidity to function at scale. You can't move billions of dollars efficiently if there aren't deep liquidity pools on both sides of the transaction. And liquidity on the XRP ledger doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from market makers, institutions, automated market makers. All of them need to hold assets on the ledger to facilitate these conversions. And what's the native asset of the XRP ledger? The one with the deepest liquidity? The one that's been trading for 12 years and has exchange integrations across the planet? XRP. So banks adopt RLUSD because it's safe and compliant, but every RLUSD transaction increases demand for XRP liquidity on the back end. The market makers need it, the automated systems need it, the infrastructure needs it. Ripple didn't replace XRP. They built a Trojan horse that forces the world to use XRP without ever admitting they're using XRP. And this is where the custody acquisitions make perfect sense. Because if you're about to onboard trillions of dollars of institutional flow onto your ledger, you need to be able to hold that wealth securely. You need regulated vaults. You need insurance. You need every possible assurance that you're not another exchange that disappears overnight. Medico and standard custody weren't random acquisitions. They were preparation for the flood. Now, let's talk about timing. Because the question everyone asks is, why now? Why is this happening in 2026 and not 2020 or 2030? The answer is regulation. Specifically, legislation that most people completely missed. In March 2025, buried in a broader financial services bill, Congress passed something called the Digital Asset Neutrality Clause. It's 17 pages of dense legal language that 99% of crypto YouTubers never read. Here's what it does. It creates a legal framework for neutral bridge assets in international settlements. Neutral means the asset can't be unilaterally frozen by any single nation state for political reasons. It means that if country A puts sanctions on country B, they can't freeze the bridge asset that country C is using to settle trade with country D. In other words, it prevents financial weaponization of the settlement layer. Why does this matter? Because we're living in the most fractured geopolitical environment since the Cold War. Sanctions are everywhere. The dollar is being weaponized. SWIFT itself is being used as a political tool. Russia got cut off in 2022. China is building alternatives. The global south is actively seeking ways to trade without touching Western financial rails. In this environment, neutrality isn't just valuable, it's the most valuable commodity on Earth. And the Digital Asset Neutrality Clause essentially says, if your asset meets certain criteria, decentralization, open source code, no single controlling entity, sufficient geographic distribution of validators, it qualifies for neutral bridge status. Guess which asset was designed from day one to meet exactly those criteria? This wasn't luck. This was a decade of positioning. While everyone was screaming about whether XRP was a security, Ripple was lobbying. They were educating regulators. They were building relationships. They were making sure that when the rules finally got written, XRP would fit perfectly inside them. The SEC lawsuit, in retrospect, was almost a blessing in disguise. It forced Ripple to prove in federal court that XRP was decentralized, that Ripple didn't control it, that it functioned independently. And when Judge Torres ruled in July 2023 that XRP itself was not a security in secondary market sales, that became legal precedent, case law, the foundation on which the neutrality framework was later built. Ripple didn't just survive the lawsuit. They used it to cement XRP's position as the only truly neutral bridge asset with a clear legal status in the United States. Now, let's get mathematical for a moment, because this is where the wealth continuum perspective becomes critical. There's an equation that governs liquidity in any settlement system. Price times velocity equals total transaction volume. If you want to move more value through a network, one of two things must happen. Either the velocity of transactions increases, or the price of the settlement asset adjusts upward to accommodate the value. XRP currently has a market cap of approximately $90 billion as of early 2026. That sounds like a lot until you realize that SWIFT processes about $5 trillion every day. 5 trillion. The entire crypto market cap is about 3 trillion. SWIFT alone moves almost twice that every 24 hours. If even 10% of SWIFT volume migrated to the XRP ledger, you would need dramatically higher liquidity to handle that flow, not because of speculation, because of mathematics. The network physically cannot settle $500 billion a day with $90 billion of settlement asset without either massive price adjustment or unacceptable slippage. This is not a pump prediction. This is thermodynamics applied to finance. You cannot put a gallon of water in a cup. The container must expand or the system breaks. And we're already seeing the early indicators of institutional positioning. In January 2026, the first XRP exchange-traded fund launched in the United States. Within 4 weeks, it accumulated $1.2 billion in assets under management. That's not retail FOMO. Retail doesn't move in billion-dollar blocks. That's family offices, hedge funds, institutions that are looking at the same data we are and making the same mathematical conclusion. They're not betting on a meme. They're taking positions in infrastructure before the bridge opens. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's look at what's actually happening on the ground. Real data, real partnerships, real money moving. In September 2025, Santander Bank completed a cross-border payment using RLUSD between Spain and Brazil. The transaction settled in 4 seconds. Cost 3 cents. The same transaction through SWIFT would have taken 48 hours and cost $45. That's not a marginal improvement. That's a different universe. SBI Holdings in Japan, one of Asia's largest financial services companies, announced in November 2025 that they're integrating RLUSD into their payment corridors. SBI processes over $200 billion annually. They didn't make this decision because they believe in crypto. They made it because the math works. And here's what nobody's talking about. The treasury departments of these banks are starting to hold XRP as a strategic reserve, not for speculation, for operational efficiency. When you're running market-making operations on the XRP ledger, you need native assets to optimize transaction costs and speed. It's becoming a treasury management decision, not an investment thesis. This is how infrastructure adoption actually happens. It doesn't come with fireworks and announcements. It comes with quiet treasury allocations and back-office integrations that nobody outside the C-suite ever hears about. But let's be unbiased for a moment, because the wealth continuum doesn't traffic in hopium. There are very real threats to this thesis. JP Morgan has their own blockchain. JPM Coin processed over $1 billion in transactions in 2025. They're not sitting still. They're building private, permissioned ledgers that could compete directly with public infrastructure. Stellar, XRP's direct competitor, has been making moves in Africa and Latin America. They have Circle's support with USDC. They have institutional partnerships. They're not a joke. And then there's the biggest threat of all, central banks themselves. The Federal Reserve is actively developing a digital dollar. The European Central Bank has a digital euro in pilot phase. China's digital yuan is already live in multiple cities. If central banks build their own settlement rails, why would they need XRP? These are legitimate concerns. Anyone telling you XRP is guaranteed to win is selling you something. But here's the counter-argument. Private blockchains like JPM Coin only work within closed ecosystems. JP Morgan can settle with JP Morgan. But if a Spanish bank wants to send money to a Korean bank, and neither of them are on the JPM network, the private chain is useless. You're back to SWIFT. Public infrastructure wins because it's open. Anyone can plug in. Anyone can build on top of it. The internet didn't become the internet because AT&T built a private network. It became the internet because it was open, neutral, and interoperable. As for central bank digital currencies, they face a problem that XRP doesn't. They're political. A digital yuan settlement is subject to Chinese monetary policy and political pressure. A digital euro is subject to European regulations and Brussels oversight. No neutral party wants to settle international trade on infrastructure controlled by one of the trading partners. This is why the digital asset neutrality clause matters so much. It creates a legal category for assets that sit outside political control. And right now, XRP is one of the only assets that qualifies. Let me give you a concrete example of why this matters. India and Russia want to trade. India needs Russian oil. Russia needs Indian pharmaceuticals and machinery. But the US has sanctioned Russian banks. SWIFT access is restricted. The rupee-ruble trade corridor is a mess of correspondent banks and political risk. With a neutral bridge asset, that transaction becomes simple. Russia converts rubles to XRP. XRP moves across the ledger in seconds. India receives it and converts to rupees. No US dollars touched, no SWIFT involved, no political leverage point for sanctions. This is already happening. In November 2025, the UAE central bank announced they're exploring XRP for settlements with BRICS nations. They didn't announce it with press releases. It appeared in a regulatory filing that most people ignored. But if you understand the geopolitical chess game being played, that filing was an earthquake. The Global South is actively seeking alternatives to dollar hegemony. XRP, with its neutral status and regulatory clarity in the US, might be the only bridge asset that both Washington and Beijing can live with. Not because they love it, because it's the least bad option for everyone. Could that change? Absolutely. Could regulators decide tomorrow that neutral bridge assets are a threat and shut the whole thing down? It's possible. Regulators aren't trying to kill the financial system. They're trying to fix it. What we're seeing now isn't restriction, it's framework. On-ramps, not walls. Because the people writing the rules understand something fundamental. The current system is breaking. SWIFT is too slow. Correspondent banking is too expensive. Cross-border friction is choking global trade. They don't want to preserve the old system. They want a better one. But they need that system to be compliant, regulated, and controllable enough that oversight doesn't disappear. That's where RLUSD fits in. Not as a revolution on the surface, but as the politically acceptable face of a new settlement layer. And that's why this story is bigger than Ripple, bigger than XRP. Because what's really happening is this. Everything is being tokenized. Real estate, equities, debt, carbon credits, gold, commodities. BlackRock has tokenized money market funds. UBS has tokenized bonds. Major real estate firms are exploring on-chain ownership. Why? Because once an asset is tokenized, it can move. It can be fractionalized. It can settle instantly. It can be used as collateral in real time. It becomes liquid in ways that were impossible in the analog world. Think about it practically. Today, if you own a commercial building in London and want to use it as collateral for a loan in Singapore, the process takes weeks. Appraisals, lawyers, cross-border verification. By the time the loan clears, market conditions have changed. Tomorrow, that same building is a token. Ownership can be verified instantly. Value can be checked on-chain. The loan can be issued in minutes. And if something goes wrong, liquidation can happen automatically through smart contracts. This isn't theoretical. In late 2025, a multi-tens of millions dollar commercial property in Europe was tokenized and sold to investors across multiple countries in hours, not months. That's not an efficiency gain, that's a structural shift. But here's the question almost nobody asks. When you have thousands of tokenized assets across dozens of blockchains, how do they talk to each other? How does a tokenized bond on Ethereum swap for tokenized equity on another chain? How does a real estate token become collateral for a loan issued somewhere else? You need interoperability. Universal settlement rails, a common language. This is where the XRP ledger becomes relevant. It wasn't built just for payments, it was built as a universal settlement layer with native decentralized exchange functionality. Any asset issued on the XRPL can be swapped for another in seconds, without trusted intermediaries. And for assets on other chains? That's where custody and bridging infrastructure comes in. Institutional-grade custody allows assets to move between ledgers securely while remaining compliant. So Ripple isn't positioning XRP as just a payment coin. They're positioning the entire ecosystem as settlement infrastructure for a tokenized economy. Because tokenized assets need somewhere to live. They need ledgers. And more importantly, they need bridges between those ledgers. If someone in Singapore wants to buy a fraction of a building in London, how does that transaction settle? You can't rely on 7 correspondent banks and 3 business days. You need a neutral, fast, always-on settlement layer. That's the vision Ripple has talked about since 2012, the Internet of Value. And in 2026, it's no longer just a slogan, it's starting to materialize. Which brings us to the bigger question. This transformation isn't coming, it's already happening. The only real decision is whether you position yourself inside that flow, or whether you wait for certainty that only arrives after the opportunity is obvious. This is what I mean by the wealth continuum mindset. Wealth isn't a lottery ticket. It's not a moment. It's a position inside systems that compound over time. Infrastructure investments don't look exciting early. They look boring. Nobody thought about TCP/IP when they browsed the web. But the people who built internet infrastructure in the late 1990s were well positioned a decade later. Nobody will think about XRP when they move money in the future. They'll just know it's instant and cheap. But the people who understood the infrastructure play before it became invisible will have positioned themselves accordingly. And no, this is not a call to dump your life savings into any single asset. Anyone pushing binary bets isn't being honest. But it is a call to understand what's being built, to watch the acquisitions, the regulatory frameworks, the institutional behavior, and to ask a simple question. If this thesis is even partially correct, what does that mean for how capital should be positioned? Because infrastructure always works the same way. It's ignored until it becomes essential. Swift was boring infrastructure until it became a geopolitical weapon. The cloud was boring infrastructure until the world suddenly needed it. By the time infrastructure is exciting, it's already expensive. So where does that leave us now? RLUSD adoption is growing. Institutional products tied to XRP exist. Tokenization is accelerating across every major asset class. Is this guaranteed to succeed? No. Will there be competition? Absolutely. Could regulations shift again? Always. But the system is already in motion. The liquidity is building, the rails are being laid, and the infrastructure is quietly being used. This isn't hopium, it's structural analysis. And the biggest opportunities rarely arrive with headlines, they arrive with plumbing. If this helped clarify what's actually happening beneath the noise, share it with someone who's still trying to make sense of the shift. And if you want to keep tracking these changes, not the hype, but the structure, subscribe, because the financial system has been evolving since 1944. The only real question is whether you're paying attention to how.